Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric, and we like to build unconventional commander decks here on this channel. Today I want to introduce you to my good buddy, Old Stickfingers. Actually, only his closest friends call him that, and we're not exactly friends, more like acquaintances really, so I'd probably better use his formal title, Dr. Stickfingers. And while he may be a doctor, well, he's still old. He got his degree back when you could pay for your tuition with just the cash you earned from your summer job at the 7-Eleven, back when knowing Latin meant that you were hot stuff and not just some Harry Potter nerd, back when doing research meant spending a lot of time in the stacks at the library, rather than just trying to figure out which Sci-Hub site is still up. But I digress. Who is Dr. Stickfingers? Well, he is a legendary horror that costs X black-green. When you cast Stickfingers, you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X creature cards. Put all creature cards revealed this way into your graveyard, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Also, Stickfingers' power and toughness are each equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So Stickfingers is a powerful self-mill engine that can get really big depending on the size of your graveyard, also whether or not your opponents have a Bojuka Bog in hand. Most notably, notice that when you pay the X in Stickfingers' casting cost, you don't mill X cards, you mill the next X creature cards from your library into your graveyard. For example, if you cast Stickfingers for a total of 5 mana, so X equals 3, and you only have 3 creature cards in your deck, then those 3 creature cards will be going into your graveyard. So Stickfingers is a very effective tutor, provided you only want to tutor for creatures, you have very few creatures in the deck, and you don't mind if the cards you tutor for go into your graveyard rather than your hand. And even better, Stickfingers is a tutor that's hard to interrupt, because his triggered ability is an on-cast trigger. It's not when Stickfingers enters the battlefield, so even if Stickfingers is counterspelled, you still get its self-mill triggered ability. Now this lends itself to some instant win combos, as the community has discovered. For example, if Mikaeus the Unhallowed and Triskelion are the only creatures in your deck, and you play a bunch of Reanimator spells. Or if you use Necrotic Ooze and Phyrexian Devourer and Walking Ballista, and then again use a Reanimator spell on Necrotic Ooze. Actually, a lot of these combos require lots of reanimation spells, and to be fair, probably most Stickfingers builds, whether you're going for a quick and reliable combo or just random self-mill value, you'll probably want a lot of reanimation effects or graveyard recursion effects in most Stickfingers decks. But Dr. Stickfingers is a very interesting and unusual commander with its restrictive tutoring creatures to the graveyard ability, and while you can use that ability to run infinite combos, there's plenty of other less competitive and very unique ideas that you can build using Stickfingers to tutor very specific creatures into your graveyard. And again, all these decks will require is that you build with very few creatures in your deck, so that a single cast of Stickfingers will put exactly what you want into your graveyard. Oh, and you will need those reanimation or graveyard recursion spells, unless whatever you're finding is considerate enough to reanimate itself. So today we're going to go over 50 cool creatures that you could build around as the hidden commander of your deck with Dr. Stickfingers in the command zone. We'll cast Stickfingers to put a very specific creature or two in the graveyard, then probably use reanimation spells or graveyard recursion spells to get those creatures into play. This way we can build around creatures that couldn't normally go into the command zone, or in color combinations that we wouldn't normally have access to. So let's get to that list. A couple of disclaimers first. First, I'm not covering those infinite combo builds, so all of these creatures will generally generate much more finite value for you, and lead, as a result, to much more variation in the deck's play. Also, these build-around commanders aren't in any particular order, except for the last one, the number 1 spot. That's a special creature that fits really well in a Stickfingers deck that wants to tutor specific creatures into your graveyard, but we'll get to that later. Otherwise, again, this list isn't in any specific rank order, it's more organized by category. So let's move on to our first of 50 build-around creatures. And our first build-around option is an Aetherborn Tribal deck with Midnight Entourage. This is a 3/3 Aetherborn rogue that costs 2 black. It has other Aetherborn you control get +1/+1, and whenever it or another Aetherborn you control dies, you draw a card and lose 1 life. Midnight Entourage is the only creature that specifically cares about the Aetherborn tribe, making it the perfect commander to the tribe, well, except that it isn't legendary, but Stickfingers doesn't care about that. There are 16 total Aetherborn creatures in Magic, and 15 of them are playable in Golgari colors. They range from reasonably useful commander cards like Gifted Aetherborn to vanilla 3/4s for 4. The only drawback is that if we play all or at least most of these Aetherborn in our deck, we'll need to cast our commander possibly several times, or just once for a large amount of mana, to ensure that Midnight Entourage goes into the graveyard. On the positive side, the fact that we'll need a lot of reanimation spells in our Stickfinger deck works really great with Midnight Entourage, since Midnight Entourage wants our Aetherborn to die so we can draw cards, and then we can reanimate them and do it again. And of course, playing Midnight Entourage in our Stickfingers deck is one of the few ways to play Aetherborn Tribal and get reasonably confident access to the tribe's only Lord effect. Next up, have you ever wanted to play Golgari Enchantments? Are you suspicious that Pharika, God of Affliction, is a terrible card? Well, with Stickfingers in the command zone, you can run a few strong enchantment payoff cards in your deck, and find them relatively reliably. Eidolon of Blossom, Cetizen Champion, and Hateful Eidolon all reward you with card draw if you're playing around with enchantments. Eidolon of Blossoms draws you a card whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control. Cetizen Champion also draws you a card when an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, and it also gets a +1/+1 counter. Hateful Eidolon has lifelink, and whenever an enchanted creature dies, you draw a card for each aura you controlled that was attached to it. And there's more enchantment payoff creatures than just these enchantresses. These 3 are just an example. And there are plenty of auras in Golgari colors that you could use to buff up these creatures to make them a threat in combat. Cetizen Champion and Hateful Eidolon make decent recipients for such auras because the champion gets bigger as you play more enchantments, and the Hateful Eidolon has lifelink to help maintain your life total. You could also play with curses. There are 17 total curses in Golgari colors to pick from. Finally, you'll need graveyard recursion to pull these enchantresses out of your graveyard when Dr. Stickfingers finds them, and there are plenty of enchantments that can help you do this. So if you ever wanted to play almost no creatures Golgari enchantments, well then Stickfingers might be the commander for you. Moving on, there's also Tetzimoc, Primal Death. This is a 6/6 Elder Dinosaur with Deathtouch that costs 4 black. You can pay black and reveal it from your hand to put a prey counter on target creature. You can only activate this ability during your turn. Then, when Tetzimoc Primal Death enters the battlefield, you destroy each creature your opponents control with a prey counter on it. Now, Tetzimoc is a legendary creature, so it can already be your commander. But if you really like Tetzimoc, there are pretty compelling reasons to play it as the only creature, or at least one of only a few creatures, in a Stickfingers deck. Primarily because Tetzimoc is awkward to use from the command zone. Tetzimoc's primary ability requires that you reveal it from your hand, so if Tetzimoc were your commander, you generally need to cast it, then bounce it to your hand, except that Mono Black has access to very few bounce effects, so likely you would just sacrifice it to some effect and then use Graveyard Recursion to bring it back to your hand. Putting Tetzimoc in a Stickfingers deck simplifies this process, because Stickfingers can quite easily just dump Tetzimoc into the graveyard. Then you'll use all of your Graveyard Recursion effects to bring it to your hand. And you'll still want plenty of sacrifice effects, so you can repeatedly use Tetzimoc's ability throughout the game, since it puts prey counters on things when you reveal it from your hand, but you actually need to get Tetzimoc onto the battlefield to kill those creatures with prey counters on them. Using Stickfingers as your commander for a Tetzimoc deck also gives you access to green, so you'll have access to good ramp and pump spells or whatever you want to use to help you win the game after you've decimated all of your opponent's creatures. You can also use Stickfingers as the commander for a tokens deck. Beledras Witherbloom, for example, is a very powerful token generator that's relatively newish from Strixhaven. It makes a 1/1 pest creature token for you at the beginning of each upkeep, that includes your opponent's upkeeps. Those pests have, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. It also lets you pay 10 life to untap all lands you control, and you can do this only once each turn. Now Beledras is very strong, both because it makes you a lot of tokens, and because untapping all of your lands is very powerful, even if it costs you 10 life. Now Beledras can already be your commander, But if you put it into a Stickfingers deck, you can combine it with other powerful token generators for even more creature tokens. Sedgemoor Witch creates a pest token for you whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, which will probably happen a lot since you won't have any creatures in your deck. Wolverine Riders also makes a 1/1 elf token for you at the beginning of each upkeep, and whenever another elf enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. Now I like these 2 creatures to support Beledros for a tokens deck because the tokens they generate help you gain life, which helps offset the 10 life you'll pay when you use Beledros' powerful activated ability to untap your lands. But there are other effective token generators too. A Tendershoot Dryad makes a 1/1 Saproling token at the beginning of each upkeep, and if you have the City's Blessing, then all of those Saprolings get +2/+2, which is great. And of course there's Avenger of Zendikar. This guy is a commander staple and it needs no introduction. It makes a plant token for each land you control when it ETBs, and it has landfall to pump your plants. Avenger of Zendikar is even better with all of your graveyard recursion that you'll naturally have in your Stickfingers deck just to make the deck work. These are a few examples of creatures that make a lot of tokens for you with very little effort on your part, and getting a few of these in play at once will let you easily overwhelm your opponents with tokens. The rest of your deck can focus on payoffs for having all these tokens, like Mass Pump effects in green, or Sacrifice and Aristocrat effects in black. Okay, this next one is a really cool non-legendary creature. Dream Devourer is a 0/3 Demon Cleric that costs 1 and a black. It has each non-land card in your hand without Foretell as Foretell. Its Foretell cost is equal to its mana cost reduced by 2. And when you foretell a card, Dream Devourer gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So when you foretell a card, you exile it from your hand face down by paying 2 colorless mana. Then, on any later turn, you can cast it just as you normally would by paying its foretell cost. In the case of Dream Devourer, that's its mana cost reduced by 2. Now, foretell is a mechanic from the Kaldheim set, and there are 42 cards in all of Magic that have foretell. The fact that Dream Devourer gives every single card in your hand foretell, except for your lands of course, this is incredibly awesome, and you can definitely build around this effect. Now, where you take this deck is up to you. I'm interested in a sort of group discard deck that hates on everyone's hands, but of course you can just foretell all the cards in your hand so you won't have to discard them. That said, this would probably not be a fun deck to play against. Also, when you foretell your instant speed interaction, it'll be a lot easier to use that instant speed interaction when you need it. Well, as long as you don't need it this turn, because you can't cast a spell you foretold on the turn that you foretell it. You could also foretell everything from your hand to take advantage of the Hellbent mechanic, which rewards you for having no cards in hand. That said, there are only 11 cards available in black and green that have Hellbent in all of Magic. So Dream Devourer is really powerful and very unique, and if you ever wanted to build around foretell, then putting Stickfingers in your command zone is a great way to do it. Stickfingers also allows you to play a Voltron deck in some unique ways. Gargos Vicious Watcher is typically a Hydra Tribal commander, but it's also a decent Voltron commander with its big 8/7 body and vigilance. It's also great at keeping your opponent's creatures off the field, with its triggered ability to let Gargos fight a target creature you don't control, whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell. Now, putting Gargos in a deck commanded by Stickfingers lets you add black to your color identity, and you only have to pay the reasonable cost of needing to jump through some small hoops to get Gargos into play from your graveyard. Oh, and of course, probably using it as a Voltron deck rather than a Hydra Tribal deck, because again, the more creatures are in your deck, the harder it'll be to tutor any specific one of them into your graveyard with Stickfingers. Now, I also like Traxos, Scourge of Krug. This is a somewhat janky colorless commander. It's a 4-mana 7/7 with trample that enters the battlefield tapped and doesn't untap during your untap step. No, that sounds like a downside, but it's actually useful since you untap it whenever you cast a historic spell. For example, any artifact spell. So Traxos basically has pseudo-vigilance. Now, just like with Gargos, playing Traxos in a Stickfingers deck gives you access to more colors, letting you do things with Traxos that you couldn't easily do in a colorless deck. You know, like play land-based ramp and kill spells. There's plenty of other non-legendary creatures that you could build into a Voltron-like deck with Stickfingers as well. I'll give a few more examples here, but there's plenty of others as well. Stonehoof Chieftain is a simple one. It's an 8 mana 8/8 with trample and indestructible. Voltron it up and smash things. Feasting Troll King is unique and also resilient. It's a 7/6 with vigilance and trample that costs 2 green, 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 and when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, you make 3 food tokens. And you can sacrifice 3 food tokens to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield, and you can do this only during your turn. So I like that Feasting Troll King has vigilance, which I think is really useful in a Voltron deck, and of course trample. And you can build in other food token generators to help you recur it easily should it die. Now there's also Metalwork Colossus, an 11/11 artifact creature for 11 mana, but it costs X less to cast, where X is the total mana value of non-creature artifacts you control. And you can also sacrifice 2 artifacts to return Metalwork Colossus from your graveyard to your hand. So Metalwork Colossus is awesome because you can easily reduce its mana cost, maybe even to 0, by playing lots of mana rocks or other non-creature artifacts. And if you're making artifact tokens or just playing with other artifacts that like to be sacrificed, you can easily pull Metalwork Colossus out of your graveyard after Stickfingers puts it there. This is one of the few such Stickfingers builds that won't need a lot of graveyard recursion because Metalwork Colossus can already recur itself. All you need to do is suit it up with some evasion like Trample, and Metalwork Colossus is a very resilient and efficient smasher. So these are some options for building a Voltron-style strategy with Stickfingers. Keep in mind though that if you use Stickfingers as your commander to find your big beaters, you won't be doing commander damage. So you'll actually need to reduce your opponent's life totals to 0 with any of these creatures to win games. So just be aware of that. Alright, so we talked about creature tokens, but let's also mention other types of tokens. Academy Manufactor says, if you would create a clue, food, or treasure token, instead create one of each. Now this is a really powerful ability, and it'll generate a lot of value. Academy Manufactor is another one of those creatures that would be really awesome as a commander, but it just isn't legendary. You'll have lots of cards to choose from in deck building that will either make food or clues or treasure tokens, and you can turn those tokens into mana or life gain or card draw, or just about any other artifact synergy, since they're all artifact tokens and you'll have tons of them. Now how you turn all of that value into a win condition is up to you, but there are plenty of options. And again, being able to play with Academy Manufactor practically as your commander sounds really, really cool and pretty unique. Now, Golgari decks don't typically steal your opponent's things, but there are some very powerful cards that we can build around that do just that. Dauthi Voidwalker is becoming very popular in Commander, and just imagine being able to tutor this guy out, well, at least into your graveyard, with Stickfingers' ability, and then playing a full deck of recursion so you can keep using it over and over. And the void counters it puts on the cards exiled with it will let you play any of those cards, even if you've sacrificed and recurred Dauthi Voidwalker, and if this particular iteration of the Voidwalker didn't exile those cards. It just cares that the card has a void counter on it. It doesn't care whether or not it actually exiled it. Now, not only are you exiling your opponent's things so they don't go to the graveyard, so you're denying them any graveyard recursion, but you're also stealing those things. This will make your opponents absolutely miserable. But there are other ways to keep your opponent's dead stuff in exile and steal it at the same time. Author of Shadows lets you exile all cards from all opponents' graveyards when it enters the battlefield. Then you can choose one non-land card exiled this way, and you can cast that card for as long as it remains exiled, and you can spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast that spell. And again, with all the graveyard recursion that we'll need just to get this deck to function at all, you can throw in some sacrifice outlets and then get Author of Shadows enter the battlefield effect over and over. But let's hate on our opponent's graveyard some more. There's the new Gisa Glorious Resurrector. If a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. Then at the beginning of your upkeep, put all creature cards exiled with Gisa onto the battlefield under your control, and they gain Decayed. But what about exiling and stealing things from our opponent's libraries? Well, there's Ganti, Lord of Luxury, for that. This one lets you look at the top 4 cards of target opponent's library when it enters the battlefield. You get to exile one of those cards face down, and for as long as it remained as exiled, you can look at it and cast it and spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. And if we decide that our opponents can have a graveyard again, then we can play with something like Sepulchral Primordial. When this one enters the battlefield, you get to put a target creature card from each opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So all of these creature cards give you a lot of graveyard hate and steal effects that you can use over and over again with Stickfingers in the command zone. And there's plenty of other creature cards that steal your opponent's things. Again, I've just given these as examples. Now, if you want to be a bit more ambiguous about your deck's intent, you can just play a few creatures that just give you pure value. Underrealm Lich is a 4/3 zombie elf shaman that costs 3 black-green. It has, if you would draw a card, instead look at the top 3 cards of your library, then put 1 into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. And you can also pay 4 life to give it indestructible until end of turn, and tap it. Now, Underrealm Lich doesn't push you to build in any specific way, but it does give you incredible card selection, and it'll reward you if you can play lots of cards that give you value from your graveyard, like flashback spells. You probably won't play a bunch of creatures that you can recur from your graveyard, of course, since, again, if you do, it'll be harder for you to find Underrealm Lich with Stickfingers' ability. Underrealm Lich is also pretty resilient, which makes it a great blocker to help keep you alive while you churn through your deck to do whatever it is you're trying to do. Then there's Apex Devastator, which is silly, but it might be fun, especially with all of your graveyard recursion that'll let you cast it over and over again. This is a 10 mana 10/10 that does one thing and one thing only. It cascades 4 times. So whatever big splashy non-creature spells you want to cast that cost less than 10 mana, Apex Devastator will help you cheat the mana cost on them. Now, green and black are the best Deathtouch colors, so it makes sense to combine the best Deathtouch payoffs in these colors into a single deck. Finn the Fangbearer is a 1/3 human warrior with Deathtouch that costs 1 and a green. It has whenever a creature you control with Deathtouch deals combat damage to a player, that player gets 2 poison counters. Finn is basically Infect in the command zone, which is just disgusting. Now, Finn was kept in check by being mono green, but not anymore. When you play Finn in your Stickfingers deck, you can find it pretty reliably, and also play all those great black Deathtouch creatures alongside it. Deathtouch creatures like Hooded Blightfang, a 1/4 snake with Deathtouch that costs 2 and a black, and it has whenever a creature you control with the Deathtouch attacks, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. Also, whenever a creature you control with the Deathtouch deals damage to a planeswalker, destroy that planeswalker. Now, Hooded Blightfang is a really awesome Deathtouch payoff, but it can't go into the command zone since it isn't legendary, so you'll have to tutor for it. Fortunately, Dr. Stickfingers is here to help us with that. We can also use the new Sereth, the Viper's Fang. Sereth gives all of your other tapped creatures Deathtouch and all of your other untapped creatures Hexproof, and you can pay 1 and tap her to untap another target creature or land you control. So Sereth can help us give other creatures Deathtouch, maybe some tiny annoying unblockable creatures, for example, that can then start donating poison counters with Finn, and Sereth will help us protect our removal magnets, like Finn. Now, a Deathtouch tribal deck with Stickfingers in the command zone will likely need to run more than a few creatures in the deck, so finding your big payoffs like Hooded Blightfang, Finn, and Sereth with Stickfingers' ability will be a bit more difficult, but I think it could still be worth it. Now, there are plenty of mono green or mono black commanders that just get better when you have 2 colors in your deck's color identity instead of 1. I'll mention a few here, but again, this is not an exhaustive list. First, I want to mention Ob Nixilis the Fallen. This is a 3/3 that has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may have target player lose 3 life. If you do, put 3+1/+1 counters on Ob Nixilis the Fallen. Now, I like this Ob Nixilis. It's fairly simple and straightforward, but it does something fairly unusual in a mono black deck. That being said, it being limited to mono black really hurts its landfall potential. So, what if we add green? With all of green's ramp, Ob Nixilis can get really big and start really draining out our opponents with his landfall ability. There's Jolrael, Monvoli Recluse. Jolrael creates a 2/2 cat creature token whenever you draw your second card each turn, and you can also pay 4 green to have all creatures you control get base power and toughness XX until end of turn, where X is the number of cards in your hand. Now, adding black to a Jolrael deck really increases your access to card draw, so you'll be able to more reliably make those cat tokens both on your turn and on your opponent's turns. But if you're not playing very many creatures in the deck, so that you can reliably tutor Jolrael into your graveyard with Stickfingers, you may want some other token generators, to help you finish out games with Troll Reel's activated ability, which really only works well when you've got a lot of creatures in play. What about Thrun, the Last Troll? Thrun is a 4-mana 4/4 that can't be countered, and it has hexproof, and it has pay 1 and a green, regenerate it. Thrun is a classic Voltron commander that just gives your opponents a big middle finger and says leave me alone. But it isn't really popular, maybe because it's mono green. Adding black to a Thrun deck will give you a lot more options for interacting with your opponent's boards and for finishing games outside of the combat step. Okay, there's also Omnath, Locus of Mana. OG Omnath is another mono green classic. In fact, this is the original green Omnath. It has you don't lose unspent green mana as steps and phases end. And it gets +1/+1 for each unspent green mana you have. Omnath loves to stockpile mana, and with access to black you'll be able to use a lot of game-ending spells like Torment of Hailfire or Exsanguinate. Pretty straightforward. And lastly there's Vito, Thorn of the Dusk Rose. This is a 1/3 legendary vampire cleric that costs 2 and a black. It has whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. You can also pay 3 black to give creatures you control lifelink until end of turn, but that's a pretty steep cost, and you probably won't be paying that too much in an almost creatureless deck. But adding green to Vito's color identity will give you access to a lot of additional life gain spells to help you drain out your opponents even faster. Strixhaven, for example, added a ton of black and green life gain support, and lots of these cards would fit perfectly in a black and green Vito deck. If you wanted to play with Heartless Hidetsugu, but you don't like mono red, now you can. Direfleet Ravager is a 4/4 Orc Pirate Wizard that costs 3 black. It has Menace and Deathtouch, and when Direfleet Ravager enters the battlefield, each player loses 1/3 of their life, rounded up. Now Direfleet Ravager isn't legendary, so it can't be your commander. So Dr. Stickfingers to the rescue again. And compared to Heartless Hidetsugu, you'll have plenty of opportunities for life gain in black and green to help you recover the life that you lose to Direfleet Ravager, because notice it hits all players. And this is another one of those creatures with an enters the battlefield ability, which means all of your recursion that you'll need to play this card anyways can be supplemented with a few sacrifice outlets, just so you can play Direfleet Ravager over and over again to drain your opponents to death. Now I also want to give a brief shout out to Gary here too. This guy performs a similar role, but you'll have to jump through a few more hoops to make Gary work for you. Since you'll need a high devotion to black to get much value from it, but you probably won't be playing many creatures, so you would need a lot of black enchantments or planeswalkers or something. That said, Grey Merchant of Asphodel only hurts your opponents and not you, so that's great. Now let's talk about a few more creatures that can support certain playstyles, but don't necessarily do a whole lot on their own. The Daring Fiendbonder and Slippery Bogbonder can put indestructible or hexproof counters on a creature, which might be great support for another creature you're building around. And a Daring Fiendbonder lets you pay 1 and a black and exile it from your graveyard to put that indestructible counter on a target creature, but only at sorcery speed. Now this is great because Stickfingers will be putting Daring Fiendbonder into your graveyard, which is exactly where you want it. A Slippery Bogbonder lets you put a hexproof counter on target creature when it enters the battlefield, so you'll need to use some graveyard recursion to get the Bogbonder back into your hand or onto the battlefield to use it. But with all of that recursion, you'll be able to use the Slippery Bogbonder over and over again if you need to, while Daring Fiendbonder can only be used once, since it exiles itself. Now we also need to mention Brawn. This is a 3/3 with trample, but more importantly, as long as Brawn is in your graveyard and you control a forest, creatures you control have trample. Now we've mentioned a few big Voltron creatures already that don't have evasion, and Brawn is a perfect inclusion in those decks, since again Stickfingers tutors it into your graveyard, and you can just leave it there to give your whole team permanent trample forever, or at least until someone exiles your graveyard because your playgroup is responsible and runs graveyard hate, right? But I'm really excited about Genesis. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Genesis is in your graveyard, there's those magic words again, you can pay 2 and a green, and if you do, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So if you've tutored any other creature that likes to die to your graveyard, then Genesis lets you just keep recurring that creature over and over again, once each turn. Now I'm thinking of something like Vindictive Lich, but there's plenty of other options. And finally I want to mention Elder Scale Worm. This is a 7 mana 7/7, and when it enters the battlefield, if your life total is less than 7, it becomes 7. So that's scary. But also, as long as you have 7 or more life, damage that will reduce your life total to less than 7 reduces it to 7 instead. Now, Elder Scale Worm is an interesting way to help you from at least directly losing the game, which isn't a terribly common effect in Black and Green. Now note that Elder Scale Worm doesn't actually prevent damage, so you can still get poison counters and take commander damage, so just be aware of that. But in many situations, with all of your graveyard recursion, Elder Scale Worm will be a pretty big hurdle for your opponents to get through before they can actually kill you. So those are some examples of creatures that you can tutor for that don't really give you a game plan, but can help support another game plan. Okay, so I'm excited about this one. I've been trying to figure out how to make an unconventional deck around Toshiro Umezawa, and this might be one way to do it. Toshiro is a 2/2 legendary human samurai that costs 2 and a black. He has Bushido 1, and more importantly, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you may cast target instant card from your graveyard. If that spell would be put into a graveyard this turn, exile it instead. Now, Toshiro gives you awesome value by essentially letting you play Mono Black Spellslinger and reuse your instant spells whenever an opponent's creature dies. But the thing is, Black is not that great at winning the game with instants. But if we put Toshiro in a Stickfingers deck, now we can use Toshiro's ability to reuse green or green and black instants from our graveyard. Now admittedly, if you wanted to add a color to Toshiro's color identity, green would probably be your last choice. But it is a step up compared to Mono Black. I'm not sure yet if adding green will give you many meaningful instant spells to play around with Toshiro. I know there are a few green instant speed ramp spells, so that's cool, for one. Anyways, I will definitely be looking at this one in more detail in the future. And definitely let me know in the comments if you have some ideas for this build. I really like Toshiro as he's a very unique commander, and adding green to his color identity might open up some new and really interesting deck builds. Now let's play Golgari Artifacts that isn't Glissa the Traitor. There are several cool Artifact Matter cards that can't go into your command zone because they aren't legendary, but you could definitely build around them with Stickfingers. The most obvious mention is Marionette Master. This is a 1/3 with Fabricate 3, so it enters the battlefield with either your choice of 3+1/+1 counters or 3 1/1 servo token creatures. And whenever an artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to Marionette Master's power. Now, Marionette Master can absolutely decimate your opponent's life totals. Now, whenever you sacrifice a treasure or a clue or some little artifact creature token dies in combat or whatever, someone is taking damage. And because you can tutor for Marionette Master with Stickfingers, you could absolutely build around it. And if you need some way to sacrifice those artifacts for Marionette Master, look no further than Herald of Anguish. This is a 5/5 demon with Improvise that makes each opponent discard a card at the beginning of your end step, so that's nice. But you can also pay 1 and a black and sacrifice an artifact to have target creature get -2/-2 until end of turn. Herald of Anguish hates on your opponent's hands and their creatures. It's a sacrifice outlet, it's a decent sized flying creature all in one, and being able to tutor for it is perfect. Now you can also sacrifice artifacts with Ravenous Squirrel. This is a cute and disturbing little 1-mana 1/1 that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you sacrifice an artifact or a creature. And you can pay 1 black-green and sacrifice an artifact or a creature to gain 1 life and draw a card. Now I played against Chatterfang once, and this little dork was quite the nuisance in the deck. And if you're looking to sacrifice artifacts, Ravenous Squirrel is a decent outlet. It's a bit costly at 3 mana, but it also staples on life gain and card draw, which is pretty useful. And as long as we're having our artifacts die, I always look for an excuse to play Fangren Marauder. This guy gains us 5 life whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield. Yes, that includes artifact tokens, and it includes our opponent's artifacts. Now, I generally don't recommend playing cards that only gain you life unless you have some particular payoff for it, but the sheer amount of life gain that Fangren Marauder provides makes it worth it, I think. And sacrifice 6 treasures to gain 30 life? Sounds great. And again, this is an amazing value engine that can't go into your command zone, but Stickfingers can tutor it into your graveyard. And lastly, I want to mention Karn, Silver Golem. This is a 4/4 legendary artifact creature that lets you pay 1 to have target non-creature artifact become an artifact creature with power and toughness equal to its mana value until end of turn. Even if you don't play many creatures, Karn can make a nice vanilla army for you from all of your mana rocks and whatnot. You can also animate your opponent's artifacts and then kill them with creature removal if you want. Now if you put Karn in your command zone, your deck will be colorless, and that's very limiting. But now you can play a Golgari Karn deck, if you really hate Sidri or something, or if you just really want green in your artifacts deck. Okay, there's plenty of creatures that just do mean things to your opponents, especially when you can tutor them out of your deck reliably with Stickfingers. Let's start with Myojin of Night's Reach. This is one of those commanders that doesn't work very well from the command zone. The Myojin of Night's Reach comes into play with a divinity counter on it if you cast it from your hand. It's indestructible as long as it has a divinity counter on it, and you can remove a divinity counter from it to have each opponent discard their hand. Ouch. At 8 mana, casting this from the command zone and then sacrificing it and recurring it to your hand before you can actually recast it and resolve it with that divinity counter, that's a lot of work. Now Stickfingers makes it a lot easier for you to nuke your opponent's hands with the Myojin. And let's mention Herald of Leshrac. This guy is hilarious. It's a 7 mana 2/4 with cumulative upkeep. That upkeep cost is gain control of a land you don't control. That's right, each turn you get to steal more and more lands from your opponents. Herald of Leshrac gets +1/+1 for each land you control but don't own, and when it leaves the battlefield, each player gains control of each land he or she owns that you control. So this guy isn't legendary, but being able to build around it with Stickfingers could be very funny. At least for you. Your opponents will not like this. What about Helldozer? This is a 6/5 that lets you pay black and tap it to destroy a target land. If that land was non-basic, untap Helldozer. This is another non-legendary creature that's just a mean build around. With enough mana and you can just start wiping out your opponent's non-basic lands, since Helldozer untaps each time you do so. Very straightforward, but also requires a lot of mana. But we're not done hating lands yet. Kamahl Fist of Krosa is a 6 mana 4/3 that lets you pay green to have target land become a 1/1 creature until end of turn. It's still a land. And yes, this ability can, and probably will, target your opponent's lands. Now Kamahl can be your commander, but since he's mono green, your ability to animate your opponent's lands and then kill them will be limited. But by adding black, you'll have a lot more access to creature removal to start killing your opponent's lands en masse after you animate them. And then lastly, we need to mention Kokusho. This guy is a well-known and efficient, certified mean card. When Kokusho dies, each opponent loses 5 life, and you gain life equal to the life lost this way. Now while this doesn't sound too bad, just realize that virtually anyone playing with Kokusho plans for it to die many times in a single game. With all of our graveyard recursion, we're set up perfectly to do just that if we put Stickfingers in the command zone. Okay, so those are some ideas for some of the more mean ways that you can build with Stickfingers. But we've got one more card to talk about. Okay, we're on to our last build-around card for Stickfingers, and our number 1 card is Rift Sweeper. This is a 2 mana 2/2. When Rift Sweeper enters the battlefield, choose target face-up exiled card, its owner shuffles it into their library. Now, Rift Sweeper is really important, I think, if you're building around any of these other creatures we've discussed in this video, or any similar type of build. Because in all of these builds, Stickfingers is being used just to find one creature, or maybe just a few creatures. And Stickfingers doesn't provide any other value for the deck. In fact, you're probably building an entire deck around just one or maybe just a few creatures that aren't in the command zone. That means if your build around gets exiled, it's gone forever. You're just a single Swords to Plowshares away from being unable to play Magic, and that's just not a good way to play the game. Rift Sweeper gives you some protection against exile-based removal by letting you shuffle an exiled card back into your library when it enters the battlefield. Now, I would even go as far as to say that most, or maybe even all of these strategies I've mentioned so far are virtually impractical without the protection that Rift Sweeper offers. In other words, I would include Rift Sweeper in virtually any of these decks with Stickfingers in the command zone where you're trying to tutor a specific creature or two into your graveyard. And another reason that Rift Sweeper is so awesome is that you'll always have access to it. So just like your other build-around creatures, Stickfingers can tutor Rift Sweeper into your graveyard where it's just a quick recursion spell away from giving your whole deck plan some insurance. And because Riftsweeper puts that exiled card back into your library, you can easily tutor for it again just by casting your commander. Now, Riftsweeper is not a guarantee, and you will need to protect it. If Riftsweeper is in your graveyard and your graveyard gets exiled, well then you'll need to be very, very careful. Or Riftsweeper can get exiled from the battlefield, or there's, things like Hushbringer too, which prevent enters the battlefield effects, so there are countermeasures that you'll need to be aware of. And furthermore, if your build-around creature is repeatedly exiled over and over again, it will get expensive to keep recovering it with Riftsweeper and then casting Stickfingers to go find it from your library. But Riftsweeper will go a long way toward making sure that you can do whatever it is you plan to do with your Stickfingers jank deck, and that's why Riftsweeper is number 1 on this list. Okay, so that is Dr. Stickfingers. As you can see, there's a lot of directions you could take this commander, in addition to just going for infinite combos or general graveyard shenanigans, if you're okay with a little bit of jank. I'm most interested in something like Toshiro Umezawa and perhaps some of the artifact-centric builds with things like Metalwork Colossus and Traxos, but again, there are lots and lots of possibilities. But that is all for today. Come back next time when we'll very likely cover some more content from Innistrad Midnight Hunt. I'm not sure which specific mechanic or commander we'll cover just yet. I've been working on a build using Danik Pious Apprentice as the commander because I think it's a really interesting and unique commander, but Danik is also kind of underwhelming, so we'll see if that pans out or not. Certainly let me know in the comments if there are any commanders or mechanics you'd like to see a deck built around, especially again if it's an unconventional deck, whatever that means. But that is all for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.